horrific late night swim. Everyone has frightening childhood experiences. This is mine. My parents always told me to stay away from the lady who lived next door. Her name was Gretchen. I could never understand why at the time. Often when I'd be outside playing in the garden or shooting trees with my BB gun, Gretchen would offer me candy if I go over to her house. She lived alone, and at the time, from my very blurred memory, she seemed like the nicest lady in the world. She wasn't old, and I couldn't point out anything particularly unusual about her. She was likely in her mid-40s, sporting a 70s era haircut, parted in the center with bangs, and always wore black, like a more seedy version of Elvira. Imagine early 1980s Ozzy Osbourne with only female features, pale, and more wrinkles on her face. You got it. She would sneak me into a very well-maintained 2-story house, where some sort of lavender incense was burning, seat me on her couch and hand me a glass tray of little strawberry candies and ask me questions like, "You go to church?" or "Are your parents Catholic?" I told her I thought we were Lutheran, and she said, "Well, now you're really welcome here." I liked her, and I didn't find anything threatening about her. But one day when my dad caught me walking out her back door, he jerked me as hard as he could by my arm and yelled at her to stay away from me. I do remember one strange comment she made. She asked if I've ever been baptized. I told her I wasn't sure. She then said, "Well, maybe we should get that taken care of, right?" Soon she moved away and our house remained vacant for at least a year. At the time, we had a large above ground pool. Sometimes after my parents went to bed, I'd sneak outside and go for a swim and take in the crisp night air. One night, I'd been swimming in the pitch dark around midnight. At the far end of the pool from the deck, we had a basketball hoop built into the coping. I'd been quietly shooting hoops when I heard bubbles popping at the surface at the other end. Which could have only been the pump kicking on. I ignored until I felt the pressure of a current pushing against my body from beneath the surface, and I turned around. Bubbles began to surface just ahead of where I was standing, and in a mere moment of sheer terror and utter panic, I thought I was looking back on the empty pool, until Gretchen's head ascended from the water about 2 feet away from me. She quietly slipped into the pool when I wasn't looking, and had been swimming toward me under the water the entire time, and I didn't even know it. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, and I just backed up against the wall shaking like a leaf, as she slowly waded up to within inches of me. Before it was dark, I thought for a brief moment that it was my friend from across the street, wearing a dark wig trying to scare me until she spoke. "I hope I'm not scaring you. I only want to baptize you, just like we talked about, remember?" She then stood straight up and lifted both of her arms, reaching for me. She was completely bare-breasted. "Stop," I pleaded in a dejected whisper. In the darkness, my eyes began to adjust, and I could see the most wicked smile I'd ever seen on anyone's face in my entire young life. What's even more disturbing was that in her other hand was a large wooden crucifix with a little figurine of Christ attached to it. As she walked closer, looking like she was about to wrap her arms around me, I screamed bloody murder at the top of my lungs. She swiftly and violently paddled and thrashed back to the deck, threw on either a towel or robe, and ran off across the yard into the night. I was still at the far end of the pool, screaming like mad for my parents, but they were asleep and never heard me. I stayed pressed up against the backside of the pool for quite some time, too terrified to move. I did not want to get out of that pool. Knowing she still could have been lurking in the darkness, waiting to snatch me up, it was the most nerve-wracking minute or two of my life, before our other neighbours Shelley and Joe ran outside and walked me back to my house. I ran into my parents' room and woke them up, shouting about what had just happened and crying my eyes out. I was probably about 7 or 8 years old at the time. My parents were dumbfounded when I told them about what happened. The police were called, but she wasn't found. My dad told me the next day that they didn't want me near her because they said she was a bad person. I never knew what they meant until I was older years later. They eventually told me that she had gotten into vicious arguments with my dad about our bushes being on our property line, but that didn't seem to make her a bad person. He finally told me that before I was born, she had 2 children, 2 little girls who were twins. He'd seen her beating them viciously with a belt on many occasions, shouting questions at them like, "Do you repent?" And then one day they disappeared. Though Gretchen was a suspect, she was never charged. The case of her children going missing remains cold until this day. Also, that night in the pool occurred more than 8 months after she moved away. The end.